Dwight filed that legislation. He was on the job, sworn in as a freshman state representative for about 45 days. That's a big legislative victory, Dwight. I just want to summarize the press conference here. After traveling across the state of Illinois, after meeting with hundreds of small businessmen and medium-sized businesses, the economic engine of the state, of regular people from all walks of life, productive, hardworking people, they're telling me, in a nutshell, 2 words: we're spent. They're frustrated. They're out of time, they're out of money, they're out of patience, and they can't understand why government at all levels hasn't tightened its belt like they've tightened their belt. So we're here today to talk about, and I'll answer questions next, on the 3 principal tenets of fundamental spending reform going forward. That if these 3 principles were in place over the course of the last 10 and 20 years, Illinois wouldn't face the financial crisis that it faces today. The grassroots is telling us we're spent, reform spending now for the good of Illinois, and I'm open for your questions.
Yesterday I talked to you and you mentioned that you had 5 different areas of $1 billion cuts. No?
I think there's a lot of good proposals out there on where to cut state spending. The Senate Republicans have identified $6.8 billion worth of cuts. Speaker Madigan and Tom Cross in the House have gotten together on certain budget proposals. I think those are great first steps to finally shine the light on where spending can be cut. But let's talk about spending cuts. The reason that we continually hear a debate on spending cuts and where to cut spending is because our fiscal house is not in order. So I think the purpose of today is to talk about how we can get our fiscal house in order with 3 fundamental spending reforms, and that is audits to put a restraint on government, PAYGO to develop the efficiencies of government, and audits to spotlight the inefficiencies. And that's where I think the focus and spotlight should be today, is on the fundamental spending reforms.
Of all of the things on here, perhaps, and it's a big perhaps, only workers' comp could happen by June 1st. And even things like audits, if you began them, they wouldn't be in place. What specifically are you talking about that's actually going to make an impact on the next budget? Yeah, if we had this for 10, 12 years, maybe we wouldn't be here, but we are here. And how do we move forward?
Well, it's a good question. I think we do have time in this legislative session, although time is of the essence, to put forth all 3 fundamental principles of spending reform. For instance, by cutting back spending to a reasonable level and then capping that spending going forward, that can be done in this legislative session, and it needs to be done, because what the people are saying is that higher taxes, higher borrowing, and higher spending is unsustainable for families and businesses.
You're hearing a number of different numbers. The House is 33.2, the Senate is 34.6, the governor wants to spend 35.4. What's your number? What would you put the spending cap at if you could?
Well, I'm of the belief that we don't have a revenue problem, we have a spending problem. So I think the purpose and focus of today needs to be on fundamental spending reform.
Would you cut it back to 29? What would you spend? What's the price tag? You looked at the numbers, you looked at the revenue projections, you looked at Quinn's proposed budget. Got a price tag?
Well, I'm going to take my cues right here from Toni Preckwinkle on the Cook County Board up in Chicago. The Cook County budget is about $3.6 billion. She was just able to get consensus on a budget that cut $500 million. It was a 16% cut up there. And this is the process that she used. She outlined fundamental principles and then negotiated the cuts with her agency heads and department heads, and they were able to cut 16%. I'm not a legislator. I'm not trotting out a budget today. I'm outlining the fundamental principles of spending reform, and then the budget cuts are up to the lawmakers to negotiate, and I'm comfortable with that.